The parable of the tenants in the vineyard. Then Jesus spoke to them in parables. Once there was a man who planted a vineyard, put a fence round it, dug a hole for wine press, and built a watchtower. Then he let out the vineyard to tenants and left home on a journey. When the time came to gather the grapes, he sent a slave to the tenants to receive from them his share of the harvest. The tenant seized the slave, beat him, and sent him back without a thing. Then the owner sent another slave. The tenants beat him over the head and treated him shamefully. The owner sent another slave, and they killed him. And they treated many others the same way, beating some and killing others. The only one left to send was the man's own dear son. Last of all, then, he sent his son to the tenants. "I am sure they will respect my son," he said. But those tenants said to one another, "This is the owner's son. Come on, let's kill him, and his property will be ours." So they seized the son and killed him, and threw his body out of the vineyard. "What then will the owner of the vineyard do?" asked Jesus. "He will come and kill those men and hand the vineyard over to other tenants. Surely you have read this scripture. The stone which the builders rejected as worthless turned out to be the most important of all. This was done by the Lord. What a wonderful sight it is." The Jewish leaders tried to arrest Jesus because they knew that he had told this parable against them, but they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away.
Thank you to the Bow family for our readings. Have you ever visited a vineyard? We did some years ago, and it was very interesting to see the vines all planted in rows and to learn something of the process of pressing the grapes and fermenting it, and of course to sample the wine at the end too. There were many vineyards in Israel in the time of Jesus, and it was part of Jewish culture. In the Old Testament, vines were a symbol of the fertility of the land, something for them to enjoy along with the figs and the olives and the milk and the honey in God's promised land. Israel itself as a nation was described allegorically as being a vine that God had planted, or as a vineyard that the leaders had charge to take care of. And it's picking up on this allegory that Jesus tells the parable that we've just heard. It has strong resonance with a passage in Isaiah chapter 5 that's known as the Song of the Vineyard. And in that, Israel is the vineyard, judged to be not producing good fruit and therefore threatened with destruction, a prophecy of the coming exile. There are similarities in Jesus' parable, although the judgment here falls not on the vineyard, but on the tenants who are trying to claim it as their own. So let's just think our way through it. Jesus begins by describing the care the owner invests in his vineyard. He plants it, builds a fence, he prepares the wine press, he builds a watchtower. This isn't just a few random vines in a field, it's well set up and cared for. It's not cared for by the owner directly, but by the tenants. And of course that would be common in Jesus' day as now, that the landowner employed others to do the work, but he still kept that oversight and care. When the season came, he sent a messenger to collect his share of the produce. So clearly he was behaving fairly in taking what was due to him, and presumably the tenants were getting their fair share too. But it's now that their evil nature is revealed. Instead of paying what's due, they beat up the first servant, they beat up the second one even more violently and insult him, and the third one they kill. There is an escalation in their crimes. So what does the owner do? Well, this is the crux of the story, really. He could at this point send the authorities to have the tenants arrested and brought to justice. But instead, he chooses to send his beloved son, unarmed, into this den of evil. Why? Well, it seems as if he gives them a final chance, an opportunity to change their ways and to treat this son with the respect they should have given to the messengers. Was he hoping that then there would be a renewed relationship and they would continue as tenants? That would involve some forgiveness for all that had gone past, but we never get to find out. The escalating of violence of their crime continues. They kill the son and throw his body out of the vineyard, thinking now that the inheritance will be theirs. It's possible that with the only son and heir dead, they were going to claim some land rights through living there. They've gone from not just refusing to pay what was due, but to claiming the land for their own. How they've maltreated that owner and misjudged him too. He wasn't remote and disinterested, nor was he powerless. He cared for his vineyard, and so now he comes to destroy those tenants and give it to others. He'd acted with immense grace in giving them a final chance, but they were so wrapped up in their path of destruction that they couldn't recognise or respond to it. And Jesus tells this parable in response to the Jewish leaders who are challenging him and questioning his authority shortly before he has cleared the temple, and they are outraged. He tells this story in order to prompt them to work it out. But sadly their hearts are closed. They don't want to recognise him as being the son in the parable, graciously offering them a final chance. Instead, it just fuels their desire to have rid of him. And so this parable becomes a prophecy of what happens next. But what does all this mean for us? Well, at one level, the parable prompts us too to be thinking who Jesus is and what authority he has in our lives and how we respond. It's salutary also to put ourselves in the place of the religious leaders and question whether as a church we are engaging in wrong-headed, empty ritual or in real worship and love of God, seeking his kingdom and not our own. The Shaped by God Together process in collecting stories is seeking to find out where God is at work among us in these unusual times and how that might inform our future priorities for worship and mission. But then another way in which I think this parable can speak to us is to see ourselves not just as tenants of God's church, but of his world. Sometimes rather like the evil tenants in the story, we forget that it's not ours to do what we want with, but belongs to God. Psalm 24 says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." We are tenants or stewards given charge to rule and care for a world God made and loves. As we've been working our way through the creation story of Genesis, we've noticed the repeated phrase, "and God said," that indicates God speaking the world into being. And we've talked about the power of his word in doing that. But why? We haven't thought about why God created the world. It wasn't in response to warring gods, as we heard in some of the other creation myths. Nor do I believe that it was something that God in some way needed. We don't get any sense of that from the Genesis poem, but rather a wonderful freedom and joy that this was something God wanted to do. Perhaps we catch a small glimpse or of an echo of it in our own creativity. There is a joy of expressing yourself and pouring your love and care into whatever you create. A sense of self-giving, whether that be through music, painting, writing, building, designing, whatever it is that we're creating. It carries something of ourselves. We invest in it. And I think in the same way, we can see the world as having something of God's fingerprint. Creation speaks of the nature of God, creating in joy and abundance. We really heard about that in the Genesis reading today. Every kind of tree and plant and fruit, all bearing seed. And God saw that it was good. That's another repeated phrase that comes every day of creation. And that speaks of a God who is interested and engaged with his creation, looking at it and seeing to it that it is good. As a church, we've been creating a Patchwork Banner. Early in lockdown, people were invited to contribute a green square that had been decorated in some way as a sort of sign of us being apart and yet still held together in God's love. And Ruth Valerio, in her book Saying Yes to Life, talks about a tapestry she created with love and care that was precious to her. And then she imagines what it would feel like if she came home one day to find that her children had taken it from its place on the wall and used it to wipe their muddy feet. They wouldn't ever do that, she said. They love me and they know what it means to me. But she wondered, is that what we have done with God's world? Taking it as something that we can just use for our own purposes, rather than recognising its intrinsic value as something God made and loves. We are stewards and tenants, and as we've been considering lately, we're not doing a very good job of it. Today from Genesis we heard about God creating land and plants, and I want to end by thinking a little about trees. I love trees. I've come now to the area of the woodland where we meet for Forest Church. Just try to show you. We have some wooden log benches where we sit, and this whole area is surrounded by tall trees, and it is beautiful to look up through the leaves up to the sky beyond and to have the light coming through. There's so much beauty and variety, and it's awesome how old and majestic some trees become, giving us a real perspective of time. They act as lungs for the earth, taking in carbon dioxide and giving out oxygen, and their roots also give stability to the land. They're a crucial part of the ecosystem, which we're beginning to realise more and more as deforestation causes increasing problems around the world. We're clearing forests at a phenomenal rate, mostly for livestock and for agriculture, much of which goes to feed that livestock. It's going to be critical to change our food production and our consumption habits. But there is hope. Some organisations have begun tree planting and are already seeing amazing improvements. And I'm going to end this talk with a clip from an organisation called One Tree Planted, which I think explains deforestation well. And that will be followed by a song from the Resound Doxicology album, echoing our own song earlier. Lord, have mercy.